Everybody seems to have settled in, so I'll get started for the second time now. Hope you had a good conference so far. I know it's nearly over. Kind of sad, isn't it? I'll be talking about debugging past, present, and future. I'm Derick. I work for MongoDB. I will not be talking anything about that right here. If you have any feedback after the talk, you can go to Join In and leave some feedback. I will repeat that URL at the end of the presentation too. So I'm Derick. I'm a Dutchman living in London. I work on the PHP MongoDB driver. I also wrote Xdebug. This presentation will feature some Xdebug, but not all of it. I did a whole bunch of other PHP stuff as well. If you have questions about that, find me later after the presentation. And I like maps, which has, again, no relevance to this talk whatsoever. All right, so today's agenda is we're talking about the past, the present, and the future. And you'll see in the different types of headers that I put on my slide. I know high-tech. Old font in the past, sort of current font in the present, and I have a futuristic font for the future, right? So let's get started with the past. Vardumps. How many of you still use Vardump debugging all the time? Yeah, yeah, I know. The hint was in all the time that you hadn't heard yet. Yeah, I do this too. I mean, it's not really something to be too much ashamed about, but at least when you're doing var dumping, have something installed that makes it prettier for you, right? And there's various options for that. So a few things I'd like to have a look at is Xdebug. When you install that, it will also produce something that looks a little bit nicer. But in many cases, I find people not really using Xdebug for even this kind of stuff. And I found it kind of interesting, and I did some research and see what else is out there. So I'll get there in a moment. So basically what it does, it enhances the way how var dumps are displayed by default. So we'll tell you something about the data types. Hopefully you can see this all the way in the back because it's kind of small. So it tells you something about the data types here, different colors, different data types. If it's a float, it tells you float. This is, of course, pi. Maybe it should figure out it's actually saying pi there, and it should show you it like the pi sign. That'd be cool. You have class names, and then it has a reference number. And if you have a self-referencing object, it will refer back to this and this kind of stuff, right? It is a simple visual hint to make dumping information better or nicer. And there's lots of different settings that you can configure as well. You can configure how many array elements, when to cut off strings. Like if you have like a file loaded in a variable, which is 4 megabytes, you're really not very much interested in dumping that on the screen every time you dump a variable in a nested structure, for example. So there's a few settings for that. If you really don't like it, you can turn it off by turning it off. So Xdebug does do this in an HTML environment, if you have HTML errors turned on, but it will also do this on the command line. So in slightly later versions, it will show you a few colors, and what's more important is that it will respect the settings that you make. But there's a few other variants as well, all PHP solutions. There's a few of them, and there's some good IDEs in them, so I think I should show them. I might steal those later for Xdebug. But there's a big difference, right? Because Xdebug, where you would do a var dump, you don't necessarily know in which context you are, right? You can be in just a normal HTML element at some point, or you can be in an HTML attribute, and various things like that. So it's really difficult for me to generate really nice HTML that with JavaScript you can expand and close and things like that, because you might end up in a context where, yeah, you can't do that, right? You cannot inject JavaScript and HTML attributes. Well, you can, but it's not really going to do what you want it to do. So there's a few of those other solutions that, because they're pure PHP, people tend to use this in like template kind of things, where it is less of an issue to show that. But just let me show a few. This first one that I found is something called Ladybug. You can see I'm using the old style font here because I don't think it's great. Because the only thing it really does when dumping this var information, remembering this big thing here, it actually only shows you the top level fields here, which isn't great. You can't click on anything. It doesn't show you any other information except for maybe float, and that's basically it. So why would you use this? I don't know. But there's better variants. There's better variants, and I know this is really small, but it runs in an iframe, and I really can't make it bigger, and I tried, and then when I do so, the whole layout goes away. So I know this is really small, so I'll just describe what it says. So this is a tool called Crumo, and Crumo enhances it by like opening and closing things. So there's an arrow here, and then it has a few dots, and it says array 3, meaning that it's 3 Yeah, I knew that was going to happen. Let's see. I can squeeze my ear bits there. So let me open this, and well, you get the top 3 elements. No surprise, I guess. And a similar thing we can do for the array bit, and then once more and once more. But it does a few interesting things. Like here, it says protected timestamp and an integer, and then has a big number, which is a Unix timestamp. But it also renders what the timestamp actually means, which is actually really kind of useful to have. Because I cannot read timestamps. I mean, my watch doesn't do Unix timestamps. Actually, it probably does, but still don't want to use it. And things like that in there is kind of handy. It also shows you like when you get recursion because of the self-referencing objects. So it adds a few nice things. Then the third one I'm looking at is something called kint. And again, this is a replacement. You call a function after doing this. And I think it's a bit nicer because, first of all, you don't have to click for every single level. You just have to do the top level next once. And it also does do interesting things like if it found like a color variable in there, it will actually show you that specific color. So in this case, you get, let's see if I can make this, there you go. So there's like a protected property called color, and it says 004499. Again, I cannot read that information because I don't know really what it says, but it shows you the color and hexadecimal things. And again, it does similar things for timestamp, which is kind of cool. Then there's Symfony's var dumper. I don't know who picked this color scheme because I can't read it on my screen, so I know with the contrast of the projector it's not going to be great for you either. But again, a very similar thing. But it does do one thing that's really kind of cool, which I would like to show, which is that if it has like a reference to an object, this basically says self xlocale, which is the name of the class, and then it has like the @1 in here, which is, if you remember perhaps from the one that Xdebug showed, is actually the reference of the object, and when you click on it, it will actually jump to that location. So if you would have jumped lots of variables in a page, and there's a link to an object in there, you can click on it, and it will jump to that specific site, which is kind of cool. So all of those 3 or 4 tools, they have something kind of cool. I wish there was just one that did all the cool things together and a slightly better color scheme than this one. That'd be awesome. So I might steal some of those things for Xdebug at some point. All right, so I mentioned HTML debugging, but there's also similar things on the command line. At the moment, it's not turned on by default, but I'll probably fix that at some point. Again, you get different colors for different data types. Again, not rocket science. And errors as well. This is probably one of the features that costs the least amount of time to implement, but saving the most amount of time. The implementation of this is about 10 lines in C code, and it's saved me days and days of figuring out why scripts stop working randomly. I spent like an hour or so in the afternoon implementing this, after I've spent like a day and a half figuring out why our scripts suddenly stopped working. So what we had is we had a company I was working for in Norway, content management system, talking to MySQL, and the website was just working just fine. But when you would run a script from the same directories on the command line, it would just die. It wouldn't say anything, wouldn't do anything. So you start debugging that, right? And this is the time where Xdebug didn't have a single-step debug yet, or not one that was useful enough to actually do that. And I figured out that after about 2 hours that the script would die on a MySQL connect call, which is kind of weird because MySQL this is fall off again, yes. MySQL connect, you won't too often silence with the @ sign because it throws like connection warnings if it can't connect, if it can't find a host. But it will then just silence the error and just give you a resource anyway. Now, if you don't have the MySQL extension loaded, it will just die with a fatal error immediately and you have no idea what happens. And the fatal error got silenced by the @ operator. So there went 2.5 days of my life, or however it was. So spend an hour implementing this, and now everybody is happy. I'm considering turning on Scream by default, but I'm not sure how much noise that is going to generate, because I know there's lots of PHP scripts that sort of rely on on silencing at least network-related issues in their applications. But as a development tool, maybe. So I have a full audience now, so I can ask you about this. Who thinks this is a good idea to turn this on by default? And who doesn't think it's a good idea to turn on by default? Sorry, the first group won here. Okay, settled. All right, so I looked a little bit at how you do var-dump debugging, which is to help you with doing var-dump debugging, which is great. One of the other things that I always struggled at is looking at somebody else's code, which I end up doing quite a lot, is I had absolutely no idea what I was actually doing. And so I sat down and implementing a feature called tracing. And tracing basically allows you to dump everything that your script does to a file. All right, so there's three different types of files that it generates at the moment. So there's one that's called a textual description, which it's actually, I'm just going to show that. It's much more fun. Live demos, what do you think? Live demos that I haven't prepared, even better. No, I'm not that crazy. All right, so what I've done in my browser, actually I have installed like a little extension. It's called the easiest Xdebug helper or something. It's the third version of this helper, because it was easy Xdebug helper, then was easier Xdebug helper, and now there's easiest Xdebug helper. I'm not sure what I'm going to do for the next one. But in any case, what it does is it installs like three little icons here. So there's one that is for debugging, which I'll get back to in a moment. There's one for enable tracing. So what happens if I click that? Nothing. The only thing that really does is actually sets a cookie. But when I now reload my slides, because this is all runs in a browser, as you can see. Give me a second. I'll actually open a shell and make it a bit bigger. I will have so many of those files, so that I will just delete all of the ones that I have here and then try again, because then I know I have the right one. All right, so I will now have a file in this location that has just generated. That shows, ooh, that's really big. It shows me everything that has happened in the full execution of the script. So the first column that you see here is the time index, and this is the start of the script. Anybody wants to guess why this doesn't start at 0? The PHP needs to parse the first script that it's going through, which takes 1.3 milliseconds here. It's not a lot, actually. The second column tells you here how much memory is in use at this moment. And then you see arrows basically showing which function calls which function. So the first function that we have is the main function here, which gets started in file show2 on line 0. The first thing it does is calls require, and it tells you the path in it. This calls dir name, and then there's two more lines that belong actually to the function call. So the first one is the return value of this function. So what base name does, it basically strips out the last file name, right? You might know this. So what does actually those two lines tell you is that the return value of this function is the path, and then the third line actually tells me that I have assigned this to a variable called dir. So by going through this, I can very clearly see return values, what the values that were assigned to variables and things like that. And it's actually, if I remember how to do that. So it even does things like attaching it or like adding an element to an array, or there is setting specific array elements. Oh, sorry, I should put that on the top of the screen there. It shows you like setting properties and elements in there, and there's a lot of information in there. Also, if you see 3 question marks that basically said that, well, we have a function that accepts arguments, but we didn't pass any. It then picks a default. I haven't quite figured out yet how to actually show the default as well, but maybe that's another feature for the future. And so on and so on. So this file, as you can see for my just showing a slide on the screen, had 3,500 lines, which isn't a whole lot. But if you run this in anything like framework kind of thing, you will usually get up to like 100,000 lines is quite common to see. And if you create lots of those trace files, then you will run out of disk space. Frequently, you run out of disk space. Once in a while, I see this comment on Twitter saying, oh, My disk was full, and I just removed 17 gigabytes of trace files. So you need to be a bit careful with that. So immediately what I'm going to do right now is turn off the cookie. Actually, I'll leave it in because I want to show a few more things here. All right, so this format is quite easy for you to read, but it's really difficult to parse because it's just indentations, right? Okay, so let me remove the file. Yeah, yes, no, I can't do that. So in PHP INI, there's a few settings related. Actually, there's like 60 settings, but what I'm going to look at is the following. So there's the one that is trace formats. 0 means the format that I've just shown you. No, -1 that's not working. 1 is a different format. So let me restart the web server. Ooh. Reload the slides. And then look at the different format here. So this format actually shows you, actually the first column falls off the screen, which is kind of annoying. Let me fix that. All right, so the first column is the indentation level. So instead of doing that with spaces, it's now just a number. The second column is the function number. Function is just an incremental counter for each function being called. And you see that some functions, or actually all functions, have 2 entries in there, right? The first one is the entry point to the function. The second one is the exit point of the function. And for each of those, I will have memory and time index, meaning that you can write quite a simple script that goes through this and figures out how much time each function takes and can aggregate this information, which is actually simple to do. It, of course, also shows you the function name, whether it has arguments, if it's an internal function or a user-defined function. It is also now possible to actually have additional lines in there that shows you the return types and things like that. So it's really quite handy. And the interesting thing about this is that everything is tab separated, so it's really easy to parse for a script. So I wrote one, and that shows a few things. Now, the last time I gave this presentation, the script actually didn't work, so I had to use a debugger first before I could do that. But let's see whether that works this time. So that's the keyboard is like in a slanted mode. It's kind of difficult to type. Nope. So if you won't get this if you install Xdebug by Packle, but you will get it if you actually download the source code yourself. I'm just plugging the file name at the end, and then it parses, and you get some output. Actually, as you see, it went actually pretty fast, right? But again, this is only 3,500 lines. And basically what this now shows you is, scroll up a little bit, it shows you the 25 most costly calls sorted by own time. So basically what it says is that array key exists is the function that took up the most amount of time running the script. It got called 39 times, and in the total time for running this function took, what was it, 50 milliseconds? And that is inclusive time. Inclusive time is basically the amount of time spent in this function and all functions called from this function. Array key exists being an internal function. It doesn't call other functions, although things like array map actually do. So it's sorted according to the own time. It also tells you how much memory this function uses. But this is an interesting measure because it's not reliable whatsoever. It's not reliable because the way how PHP's memory manager works. It now implements like a cyclic garbage collector, which can kick in at any moment and suddenly remove like, well, half of your used memory, right? And because I don't know in which function this is going to happen, I cannot account for it. So the memory number here can also sometimes include 2 megabytes of freed memory suddenly, and hence you get like big negative numbers that make absolutely no sense. So this is only a very rough guide to where most amount of memory is being used. So what you often see is like things like require and include will use a lot of memory because that adds another parse script to memory. Things like array merge, they will return an extra array of a lot of elements, so that does it a lot. So if you go through this, it actually makes sense most of the time. but not all the time. You can, of course, also sort this by other things. If I remember the name of the arguments, you can sort it by the number of times a function got called and things like that. It's a very, very simple script. It's like 70 lines of PHP code. But it does very basic profiling. I think it's something worth looking at. Okay, and then the last format that I'd like to show here, which increase this one, reload the web server, reload the slide again. Oh, let's see, too many screens open. If I now run the script, of course, it doesn't work because it cannot read it anymore. But where is VI? Now you get a very nice HTML output of this. Do not ever try to load this in a browser. I'm saying that because if you have 200,000 lines in there, a table with 200,000 rows is not going to work well. Yeah, just don't bother. So why did I do this? Because people asked me to add this. But there's a big disclaimer that if you really want to do that, fine, do it. It used to be a feature in Xdebug 1 that would output this kind of style things to the end of your output script. But that crashed my browser so many times that I removed that from Xdebug 2, but then people started complaining, oh, why did you remove this? So I'll add it back again, and a few browser crashes, not my problem. All right, I will now turn off the tracer. Yeah, I have a slide, but I don't really have to show the slide anymore. So the other thing that I now didn't have to live demo because my script actually worked is the live debugging. Vardump is really nice and handy, but if it gets really complicated, you don't really want to spend an hour adding vardumps all of your code and then another hour to remove them and another hour to find the missing one or find the additional one that you didn't get. So the live debugging that Xdebug does, it uses a DBGP protocol. It's not only for PHP. It's actually got developed together with a debugger for Python, for Perl, for Tcl, for XSLT. HHVM has now also implemented this as protocol for debugging PHP scripts running on HHVM. Its support is good, but it's not great yet. Yeah. But I'm sure they get there at some point. And it's implemented almost any IDE of any sort of decent quality that you write PHP in. I only have a few examples here: Komodo, NetBeans, PHP Storm, Vim, Emacs, Sublime, whatever you can think of that's basically plugin for debugging. I cannot cover all of those because I don't really use an IDE. I use Vim, and I don't really write PHP code, so it doesn't really help me much anymore. But in any case, I probably still should show you how this works. So again, I'm going back to the little icons here. So I will now making sure the tracing is off. I will turn on the debugging. It's like click on the little bug icon. And when you then reload this, absolutely nothing happens, which is normal because I haven't started my debugger yet. So now where do I have PHP Storm installed? I'll probably whine that I'm using OpenSDK or something. Does that? Oh, maybe it doesn't. See, this is why I don't use IDEs. It takes too long to start them. There you go. I know, it's also an old version. It's probably going to whine about the license that it got expired. But, sorry? Why do I ever close it? Because it uses memory. Anyway, so it only says there's something ready to install, to update. In any case, let me now reload the slide. And fingers crossed, fingers crossed. Okay, I probably need to turn it on, don't I? So start listening for debugging connections, then reload it. Yes. Ooh. All right, so what it does, it basically stops at the first breakpoint I've had. Ooh, and this falls out of my head from my ear again. All right, I know this is a bit small. I can't really make it big. I've tried that many times. But it basically tells you in which line it stops. So it stopped at the line configuration of PHP line 354, which is this line here where you have the blue line. And then what it allows you to do is step over to the next line. So you can follow what happened with the blue line here. And you can inspect all the variables that happen in here, which I think is also handy. So it says added is false. If you want, you can change them, but you need to be a bit careful with that, because if you change like an array to say a Boolean, then your script is unlikely going to work. But it's handy if you have like an algorithm and you notice that the number that is supposed to output is 21, but it outputted 20, then you can just change it and continue debugging, perhaps finding more bugs. So the breakpoints that you can set, they're actually really quite powerful. So you can click them in front. So go to more. So yeah, you can set you can just spend breakpoints, just having them enabled but not doing anything anymore. You can set conditions on breakpoints. So you can, for example, like compare things to variables, and if that condition matches, only then the breakpoint kicks in. You can log the messages to console. There's evaluated expressions. You can move a breakpoints once they've just been hit. There's also ways how you can only trigger a breakpoint every 5 times, for example. But I'm not actually sure whether... I don't think PHP Storm actually implements that one. Or is it here? No, I don't think it's in there, actually. So not all the features are exposed by IDEs, which is kind of annoying. But then again, there are probably features that people use so little that nobody ever sent in a feature request for it. Yeah, the single-step debugging, if you have never done this before, please try this if you get into any sort of complicated debugging situation. Anyway, I'll stop with this and move on to something else. I will skip the slides because we've just seen how it worked. Oh yeah, of course, you need to turn it on. Turning it on is kind of important, otherwise it doesn't work. So you turn it on by setting remote enable to 1. And then you can configure the remote host and port. And this is sort of important because it is Xdebug that connects to your IDE. So your IDE is actually the server and Xdebug is the client. And that's something that people tend to miss once in a while. And this is important if you have like a development server that doesn't run on your own network and your own development network is behind like a net or a firewall, then you need to have a way to punch through it, right? And there's a few tricks that you can do there, but I'm not going to have the time to talk about that so much. So because I cannot just leave this blank or use a wildcard because this is the IP address Xdebug is going to connect to. And I cannot connect to the whole of the internet and hope some IDE is listening, right? That doesn't work. But it is, of course, handy to connect back to the developer that actually wants to do the debugging. So there's a setting called remote connect back, which means that if I use a browser to access my web server, Xdebug is trying to figure out what the IP address was of the machine that created the web request by using, it looks at a remote header, HTTP header, and then we'll create a connection back to that IP address. This also works if you go through a proxy, because it works if you use a decent proxy that sets the forwarded 4 headers or something of the name of this, and then we'll also try to figure out the correct IP address and connect and make sure Xdebug talks to your IDE. Of course, if you have a firewall in the way, then you need to do other things, but there are solutions for that. All right, so you can also do this on the shelf for command line scripts, which is really handy if you want to debug your unit tests, for example. Hopefully you don't need to do that too much, but you never know. And the only thing you really have to do there is export an environment variable, which is xdebug_config, and then you need to set a value of IDE key. Whatever that is, doesn't really matter, but try to pick one that's unique in your network. Pick your name, would be my suggestion, because this is a value that is used by proxies to make sure it gets routed correctly. Again, I don't have the time to talk about that today. All right, so there is helper extensions for browsers for most major browsers. So as I said, Xdebug is now on the easiest Xdebug extension, but there's also Xdebug helper for Chrome, Xdebug toggler for Safari, and Xdebug launcher for Opera. Just show of hand, who's using Opera here as a browser? 1. Okay, congratulations. I used to give a debugging talk in Norway, in Opera coming out of Norway. It used to be like half of the audience. Which browser is missing here? So I don't know. Is it actually possible to write like simple extensions for IE to do this kind of things? I don't know whether it's even possible. So if you know whether it is possible, then please create another extension and I will add it to the slides. Yes. All right, so in case things go wrong with debugging, which happens once in a while, Xdebug actually will allows you to actually log all the communication between the debugger and the IDE. And it also tells you about connection errors when it cannot connect to an IP address or a port and things like that, which is kind of handy. I very recently added another one that checks for SA Linux. So SA Linux is like a Linux security tool that prevents things, for example, your web server connecting to ports, for example, your IDE listening on port 9000 for Xdebug connections, and will not give you any warning. So I've now added another extra checker that if it detects that it can't make a connection due to permission errors, it will tell you why, which means I don't get email about it anymore. Well, at least that's theory. We'll see how that goes. But it's actually really kind of handy to figure out when the debugging protocol works. And once in a while I get people asking me, well, it seems that Xdebug connects to my IDE, but then nothing happens. And that is never ever Xdebug's fault. It's always the IDE just ignoring the request or doing random stuff that they really shouldn't be doing. But I can prove that now with this debug log. So I also asked them, please give me this log. I look at it and say, well, on the Xdebug side it's just working fine. You need to talk to support for your IDE, which is very often the issue. Unless there's a bug. I have to debug the debugger. Right, so I don't want to talk about Xdebug anymore for a moment. I'd like to talk about something else first called VLD. And VLD is an even more low-level tool that I've written to show information about PHP scripts. And it's up to the level where it shows you every different execution unit. An execution unit is PHP assembler, sort of running in its runtime. It's a PECL extension. It will show you information about functions, methods, things like that. It's probably better to just show what it does. So if we have a function like this, right? I know it's very complicated. It throws lots of exceptions. This is, by the way, a function to show you what it can do. Having such a function that just throws random exceptions and catches them again, it's not very practical. But there we go. So yeah, it has this function. It defines three exceptions as a function that you give a number, and depending on the number, it throws a separate exception. And it does some other stuff like calculating 5 times 3 to the power of 7. Alright, so when you run VLD on this, you get output like this. I know, this is lots of things. I will skip about this bit first, but what it starts doing, it will tell you information about this specific function. And I know if you have ever seen this assembly, this looks a little bit familiar. If you've never seen that, this probably doesn't look familiar. But it actually shows you quite a lot of information about PHP's internal execution, what kind of things it does. So it has like the operation, like xnop, not meaning no operation, basically just do anything. Receive is like receiving a argument into a function. Echo, you can guess that echo something. Sendval is sending arguments to a function. Null for multiply, assign for assignments, and things and so on and so on. It also has jump instructions, like conditionals, like if statements and things like that. So VLD does a lot of analysis. It also tries to figure out which parts of your code cannot be executed. Because sometimes you get like a throwing an exception, and then immediately afterward, PHP's parser and scanner has created a jump instruction, which you can never ever reach that because it throws an exception. You throw an exception in the code after the throw will never be executed. And VLD can find that information and shows that bit of code with a star. There's likely also going to be one at the end of the function. No, not in this one. But there's a few cases where this happens here. If you ever used PHP unit with code coverage, so just show of hands, how many have used PHP unit with code coverage? Right, PHP unit will tell you which lines of code cannot be reached either, and that is information provided by Xdebug. Now, the reason why I'm getting at this is because code coverage is not your magic bullet number thingy, 100% doesn't actually necessarily mean that you've covered all of your code in all of your methods. Alright, so VLD construct like this big graph and follows whatever you can do there and things and so on. So I'll skip over that for now, but I might get back to it. Alright, so let me illustrate what I just said about code cover with a slightly simpler example. So if I have two functions here, I have a function called loopy and I have a function called if then else. I'm forgetting the loopy code. If I call if then else first with true and then with false, and then secondly with false and then with true, what will this show for the code coverage of the if then else method? You expect it to show every single line, right? Because in the first instance, where A is true and B is false, it will see if A equals true, which means it will then be recorded as a hit line. It's true, so echo A hit is also covered, the end brace and things like that. If B is false, then this line will still be hit because the check is still done, but echo B hit isn't being executed because B is false, and then the brace will not be covered here. And then in the second case, it is flipped around, right? But I haven't tested every possible path through the code. I haven't tested the cases where A is true and B is true, and the cases where A is false and B is false. So I haven't actually done 100% code coverage. I've done 100% line coverage, which is a different number. So Sebastian Bergman, the author of PHP Unit, he has been bugging me for about 1.5 years to do something about this. And I think it might have been more than 1.5 years actually. To implement something called path coverage. Now, VLD and Xdebug share quite a bit of code where it does all the analysis of which paths are possible through functions. And I like experimenting those kinds of things in VLD because it's a lot smaller code base. It's the only thing it really does. So what I thought, well, I add some branch and path analysis to VLD. So that's what I did. I mean, you still get, this is just the if then else function. It's it has like, it reads it to arguments. It is then do a jump on when the compiled variable, so that refers to A here, when it is true, basically. Sorry, when it is false, it jumps to instruction 8, which is then going to be the next if statement. If it is true, then it will continue with the next operand here. Just the echo, and then there's a jump to operand 8. As you can see, the jump, so number 7 here, jumps to operation 8, which is the next one. That's sort of kind of pointless, of course, right? But PHP's scanner parser doesn't optimize this code because it takes time to optimize the code, and if you have to use on every request, it's kind of pointless, especially if it's something simple like this. The Zend opcache, or opcache as it is called right now, I think, will optimize out things like this. But what I was trying to get at is that at the end, you can see 5 different branches that are in the code, right? The first bit is basically receiving the variables. The second branch is if A equals true. The third one is if A equals false, or A is false. And there's another branch for B true and B false. And then what it also tells you is which possible paths are there through this function, which is 4, right? You have the first bit, which is shared by all of them. Then you can either go left or right, whether A is true. It's very difficult to explain. So let me show you in a graph. That's why I created them in the first place. So those are the options, right? So the first part is you go this one, then follow all the way there. The second one is you follow this one in, and this one you skip. And then you can do skip this one, follow this one, as well as skip this one and skip this one. So those are the 4 options. And VLD now will actually tell you all the different paths through this, and it looks something, yeah, so this is the analysis. I'll get back to this again in a moment. Let's check the time, 11 minutes. All right, so something that is currently new in PHP 5.6 is php-dbg. And it's a little bit of a cross between what Xdebug does for single-step debugging and what VLD does for really low-level instructions. So php-dbg is a tool that is useful for PHP language developers, more so as probably you here in the room. And yeah, it is much more focused on that. It shows much more low-level stuff. It allows you to do single-stepping on those opcodes, which Xdebug doesn't do, and things like that. I have a video of this. how this works. So I will not show you the whole thing, but just show you a little bit. So the way how this works is that instead of calling PHP, you have to call php-dbg on the command line, and then with your script name, and then it shows you some command line stuff. So after that, you get a prompt, and then you can execute some things. Okay, I misspelled break there. So I set a breakpoint on line 69, and it tells you have done so. You type run, it then runs. You wait some more. And then, of course, the breakpoint hits, right? So it stops on this line, tells you the line, and some things around it. Of course, I want to show all the variables. So I type, well, first I want to show the backtrace. And then with info v, I show all the variable information. Now, it shows like internal memory addresses that you probably don't find very interesting. It shows a number, which I actually don't know what it means, to be honest. It shows you the type and the variable name. And if it's an object, it shows you the class, but it doesn't show you any of the values. I mean, it is possible to actually get into that, but it would be easy to do that with like a real debugger in that case. So it does things like that. It is actually quite powerful, but yeah, I haven't played so much with it that I know all the ins and outs of it. But it's certainly something, if you're using PHP 5.6, to have a play with. I don't think it's there to replace Xdebug and its single-step debugging, but it's definitely, if you're interested in how PHP works, definitely cool to have a look at. Alright, so I mentioned the code coverage with if and else, so I don't have to show you this one. This is just a slide showing that how PHP unit internally actually works. So it uses a package called PHP code coverage that you can install with Composer. So how this works is that you start a context. You have then two tests. So the first test is coverage start, and I call the test coverage 1. I call my function with true and false, and then stop this script execution, and do this once more for the other case. When I run this, process will give me a nice HTML report, which shows something like this. Everything that's green basically means this line has been hit while executing it. So this says, hey, 100% code coverage, but I've just shown you, of course, that is not quite the case. So there are some new magic sauce in the upcoming Xdebug version. See, it says so, magic sauce. That actually will do a little bit more analysis. It will also try to figure out which branches and which paths have been followed. It is not something that's done by default because it changes the internal APIs a little bit. Also, it makes things quite a bit slower. I realized code coverage already makes things quite a lot slower, but it does do a lot of stuff, so I can't really avoid that. Annoyingly, although Sebastian has been bugging me for years to implement this, he hasn't actually updated PHP code coverage to make use of this new information yet. But hopefully he gets there in a moment. So I can show you sort of what it does and show you a mock-up of how it could look like. Anyway, the output that Xdebug will provide you then is, oh, this looks very familiar, right? It looks like the paths and the branches from VLD. But the interesting thing about this is that it actually tells you whether the branch and the paths have been hit. This X1 with an X in there is a bug in this output, so don't worry about it. And it shows you that the X means not being hit, and the two hits are the paths that are being hit. So let's look at this, how this looks in a graph. Again, this is something that Xdebug can actually output for you. So you see the 4 different colors of lines are 4 possible paths for your code. If it's a dotted line, it's a path that hasn't been followed. If it's a solid line, it's a path that has been followed. And from here you can see that 2 of the 4 have been covered, right? And putting this information back into PHP unit will then tell you that you need to write even more test cases than you've already done. So this is new. Hopefully we'll get some support in PHP code coverage and hence PHP unit in the near future, and I'm quite looking forward to that. And then good luck writing more test cases. Alright, last thing I want to talk about, which is basically the future. And the future is quite interesting because what I want to do is to have a debugger that allows you to go back in time as well go forwards in time. Just like showing a picture of the TARDIS. Alright, so it is another one of those tracing formats that I've been working on. So it is a format that instead of dumping it in human readable text or computer readable text that you can easily parse or crazy HTML outputs, it is another format that basically dumps all the states of the execution of your script to a file. with trace format number 3. So what it dumps to file is something like this. I know, very low-level binary stuff. But it's sort of handy to do because you want to have compressed stuff in there, because you don't want to end up with 17 gigabytes of data every time you run the script, right? So there's a few header things. It will store the file contents in those files as well. So for every file that's been executed, it will store it in the file in a block. You can just about see the PHP tags here and the include. You can sort of read it. It's at the moment not yet compressed, but I'm going to do that as well. The axes basically mean need to fill up the block. There's other things in there, so that if you go into a function, it will create a record for that as well. And for each of those, it will also know the timestamp. So there's a few function entries. Another file, like a file is being there's a function entry. Then the first thing that the function does is do a require. Then of course loads another file that gets dumped to file. So it stores things sequentially as they're happening, and so on and so on. Some more functions being called, some more functions, and then at the end it will have like a file table, so it knows numbers with files. Basically to make sure that I can store things as compressed as I can. Looks really complicated. It's definitely not finished yet either, so that's why I'm going over this quite quickly. But in the end, the idea what it does is that it creates this file on disk, just like a trace file, but with more information even in there. And in order to make use of that, I'm going to write like a little wrapper thing that basically acts like Xdebug, but it isn't. I might put it in the extension. Haven't quite figured out yet how I do that. That reads this file that contains every single state that happens during the execution of the script, including all the stores. Making it actually really quite handy that if you need to support a software system that has been installed by your clients, they still know some bits of PHP and things like that. They can create such a file, ship it to you, and you can see exactly what happened every single time. You can go forwards, backwards in time, see which variables have changed, where they have changed, things like that. So I think that's really quite useful to have. It is a whole lot of work to do, though. And yeah, of course, I need to get the IDEs to implement those new commands for the protocol at some point. So I'm quite excited about this. I really want to continue working with that, but then PHP 7 is happening. And PHP 7's internal structures are so much different from 5 that I have to rewrite Xdebug half first, which is going to take me some time. By some time, I probably mean months to do. All right, I have about 2.5 minutes left. Oh, and I need to finish the dumper too. All right, so I'm going to publish the slides here. If you scan this QR code, you will also go to that link. If you don't want to remember this link, you can go to this one, where you will then also find this link. It's like lots of links. It's like the internet. If you have any questions, you can email me. But of course, we have a few minutes to ask me right now as well, and I'm happy to answer. Are there floating microphones? There's one there. There's a question right there. On the far end. Yes,
I think this one's dead. Could we pass that over?
Did you find a mic? Did you have a question?
Yes.
Oh, he has a question there. Sorry. Oh, the mic wasn't working. That's the issue. I can't hear that because the microphone isn't working. So the question here, I'll just repeat the question. Does PHP 7 not provide any native debugging? And the answer to that is no. There was some discussions on getting php-dbg up to a state where it was like a fully fledged debugger, replacing Xdebug, but then how do I say this in a politically correct way? There was some discussion about doing that, but in the end, I thought, me and their authors thought that maybe that's not such a good idea, so they ended up not doing it. That's all I have to say about that. Yeah. Yes. Writing a debugger is a lot of work. Okay. Hopefully I answered that right. You found a microphone?
Yes.
Yay!
First of all, thank you very much for the talk and Xdebug.
Cool.
It's amazing.
Thanks.
In terms of the path debugging, Would that cover all control structures? Because it seems to me it would very quickly become infinite in terms of the paths that you could go through.
Yes. So that's a good question.
And also, does it include polymorphism in terms of different objects you could pass to a function?
Okay, so you've heard the question, so I have to repeat it. That's great. So first, to talk about polymorphism, no, it doesn't really do that because it works on a method level only. If you call a function, you jump out of the context of this function, so it will only consider the paths in that function. It will consider the paths in each function separately, so you don't have to deal with the polymorphism really. The first part of the question was about whether it covers all control structures. So yes, it will do everything where there's a logical jump involved, which is throwing, catching exceptions, for loops, for each loops, if, then, else, while, all of the structures. And yes, of course, if you have lots of those control structures in there, you end up, it's like an exponential way of the amount of paths that you can get through your code. And yes, that can get problematic. But it only really gets problematic when your functions are too large in the first place, which basically I would probably suggest refactoring first. And yeah, if that is the outcome of unit testing, then I don't think that's a bad outcome. I have tested this with some really hairy code that actually ended up crashing it because it was so many different paths. It was like 4.5 billion. And before I ran out of memory, it just crashed because of Stack Overflow. So now there's a limit. But yeah, that is a problem, the exponential issue with paths. Anything else? No more questions? Oh, well, thanks very much. I'm around still for the rest of the conference as well, probably at the social as well. So if you have any questions, come and talk to me. If not, I think there's a refreshment break, and then there's one more slot of this conference. So enjoy.